Hello, everyone. Great to see you again. So, today I'm going to talk about external messages. Okay, so this is a topic which is raised by a member in the WhatsApp group. Um, I think we haven't really touched upon this topic uh, really because we did talk through how we can process meter reads, how we can load meter reads, and that was a very special case where we loading meter reads against the head-end system. Um, but in general, how does the inbound, outbound messages works? It's good to talk about in this video. Right, so break that down into a few topics, and first one just goes through the overview, and then second part I would like to talk about XAI and IWS. So these are the acronym in in the OUAF. We'll look at what's the differences and what to use. And then we look at inbound message and outbound message. How we can set it up in high level description, and then last we look at some other configuration related to the inbound outbound messages. Right. So to talk about inbound outbound, first of all, I think we need to look at the structure and look at the layers of technology within the framework. So if you just look at the framework C2M, it is sitting, the whole domain of the application is sitting on WebLogic, which is the Oracle version of the platform, and it is able to cater for all the messaging between systems and provide messaging within the application, which is a lot of the functionality is facilitated by the WebLogic. And on top of the WebLogic, we have application server, or we have web server, and batch server, for example. All the domain of these servers sit on WebLogic. Okay, but outside of the framework, you will be able to talk to the other systems via middleware. And for Oracle, very likely you will, if you implement project at the moment, it's very likely to be Fusion. Okay, Fusion is the default go-to middleware for Oracle, and Fusion is also sitting on the WebLogic layer, but it provides a lot of the messaging transportation mechanisms. So with Fusion, you will have products like OSB, Oracle Service Bus, SOA. So these tools will be able to help you to translate and transport the messages across to the other systems or external systems. So when we are talking about messaging, we actually consider a few things. First thing is batch or real time. In other words, whether we do synchronized or asynchronous messaging. Now, this is down to, a lot of these are down to the way we would request information. So, for example, if you request external message from, so let's say from a metering system, and you would normally have a API call to the external system, and you expect a real-time response to come back, because otherwise the batch is going to hang, it's likely to cause trouble. So this could be, something you just have to set up a HTTP real-time call, or you can use asynchronous mechanism, which normally will involve, say, we send a message out to a JMS queue, and then the middleware picks up and transport to the downstream system. Okay, the second thing is to look at what is the middleware. Okay, I said we will normally use Fusion, but that's not always the case. The reason is complex, because some of the projects, they let's say you just have application within the C2M domain. They can talk to each other using Fusion. That's not a problem, but a lot of the project, they would prefer to use a single a single middleware across all the enterprise applications. So it's not necessary all the time it will be Fusion, but of course, there are other choices. I think in general, we just need to be aware what are the capabilities of those middleware, and most importantly, do they support all the protocols, say REST API, SOAP API? Do they support synchronized, asynchronized? What is performance like? So these kind of things we need to be aware of. And last is the messaging protocol. So as I said, REST, SOAP, what is the format, JSON or XML? So these are the considerations we need to look at when we are implementing the inbound and outbound messages. Part 2. All right, so I've laid down a few differences between IWS and XAI. So a bit of history. XAI was there for the inbound and actually outbound for a long time, since the framework was there. IWS was introduced probably around 2018-19 roughly, and it comes in with the new framework, OUAF second framework 2 at that time, because IWS is able to facilitate almost all the scenarios, including SOAP, REST. The format can be configured to be XML or JSON, and it has a better performance, security support, etc. So if you look today, obviously IWS is the only solution we should be using when we're configuring the system. However, XAI is still heavily used in some project I've been to, It is only because when we look at XAI, there are a lot of inbuilt functionalities. So let's say, for example, if you create a BO and you want to submit, create a record for that BO. Now, the BO schema could be flattened. Let's say on one level of the structure, on one level of the data. Actually, at the back end, some of the data is stored in the subtable with, let's say, characteristic table, and some of the record is having complex structure, for example. Okay, some of them going to a club. So if you want to create a record, the easiest way is to submit a payload via the business object schema. Now, in the system, if you look at the if you look at the business object, you will notice there is a drop-down menu item to create XAI inbound service. And I think it's still there in the latest versions. Correct me if I'm wrong. But we haven't really seen a similar mechanism has been built for the IWS. So to make things easier, a lot of people would just create XAI and then use the SOAP message and try to create a payload based on the schema, which is very easy and quick if you want to do testing. However, as I mentioned, from today, actually from a long time ago, IWS is the only option if you want to implement inbound web service. Okay, so let's look at the inbound messages. So we look at the IWS XAI. So IWS is the option going forward. Now, IWS support both SOAP and REST. Okay, so SOAP is kind of an older technology, which is XML based, and you're able to convert the schema, and you can do a XLS validation on the schema as well. I think in SOAP you get a WSDL, and then based on WSDL you can generate a payload structure, and then from there you can populate your data and then submit the payload. Now REST is a little bit different because REST supports XML as well, but in general for REST API it is JSON based. There's one thing we have to be aware of is within the framework, the messaging between the database and the application, or database to the batch server, the messaging is XML. Okay, so internally the messaging is XML. So if we want to, maybe that's one of the reasons they haven't built this facility to quickly create the IWS setup or these shortcuts, because it's maybe there are additional things that need to be done. So the REST API is normally JSON based, so you need to convert the message between XML to the JSON. Although the converts most of the time it is simple. So for example, if you look at the schema, you have a list item, it will be equivalent to a list in a JSON format as well. But it requires you to work out some additional formatting and the matchup with between these two formats. And then if we look at how to configure IWS, let's look at the left first on this picture. So as I mentioned, the middleware, normally we have a Fusion, for example. And for the framework, we have WebLogic sitting as the domain technology. And then the OUF is the base. And then on top of OUF, you could have the CX, MX, WX. Normally they are the CCNB framework or the data layer, which is the MDM part, and then the W normally means field work, or it could be just the web service interfaces. So very often when we have middleware, we will not create any, let's say all these if we're talking about asynchronous process, okay, we will not create JMS queue within WebLogic. We will normally utilize the middleware, which is Fusion, to create JMS queue. So the framework, the OUF part will actually talk to external. C2M will talk to external system, for example, Fusion, to send out message via JMS queue if it's if that is the if that is the asynchronous call. If it's synchronous call, maybe it's just HTTP call, outbound. Inbound wise, the system would actually receive, let's say we set up IWS, system would actually receive a call, and then a process at the back end will be kicked off. That is very similar to XAI. Okay, so let's look at a few components. So let's say in the system, you can actually define what is the URI. So in this case, I've written market message 20 is actually URI, which is user-defined part. Now, the first part, the HTTP part, is actually system-generated. It's all based on how you actually set up the server, etc., and also the WebLogic domain, etc. Now, once a call into IWS, when IWS is triggered, a service at the backend is kicked off. Either it's a business object, or it's a business service, or it's a service script. And now that is same as how the XAI actually works. So they could be trigger off some actions, and they can be directly creating a BO, for example. The difference between REST API and SOAP is, for SOAP, you could submit submit XML, and that you need to define whether it's add, change, what is an action on that. But for REST API, you also need to define, but it's a bit different. You have these actions, HTTP methods, say get, post, put. Normally, I think we use get for read, and we use post for submission, for example, to write. So these are the differences between IWS and XAI. Now look at the outbound message. to configure an outbound message, it could be a little bit more complicated. Okay, so because for inbound, you just create IWS. For export, you need to define a couple of things. Let's first say look at what we need to define in terms of the message itself. Okay, so in terms of a message, if you want to define a structure, you need to create an outbound message type. And this outbound message type will actually define structures through a business object at the back end of it. So I have a reference to a business object, which have a schema that should be containing all the information you want to export. Now, if it's synchronized, what it needs to do is it needs to pick up a message sender, which has a synchronized message class. Message class for sending the message. And also for asynchronized, similarly, you will pick another class, a message class. Based on different message class, you will have different setup, because for asynchronized, let's say we will need to connect to JMSQ, for example, and then you have to provide the credentials for that JMSQ connection, and also the URL, etc. But for synchronized, let's assume it's a HTTP call, you need to define what is credential as well, whether it's username password based or it's key based, etc. So if it's asynchronized, also you have to define the JMS connection queue. Remember, we said that JMS normally is outside of the framework, so it will be something you have to define that on the Fusion layer or the middleware layer where the Fusion will pick up from. And after all, you will create an object called external system. So what that actually does is it mimic there is a system externally, and you will link all the outbound messages which is applicable to this particular external system. So from external system, you can easily see what outbound message can be created. Now here are some examples for message sender, because we have different types of requests. Let's say HTTP sender, which is likely to be a real-time call. JMSQ sender, which it sends to JMSQ probably in real time, but actually that is asynchronous transaction, which the middleware are going to pick up from the JMSQ. Or you can do a HTTP JSON sender, which means even the schema, we said schema is all defined in XML formats. Even the schema is XML. The message for export, for outbound, is going to be translated into JSON format automatically. And this is hugely important, because a lot of the system today, they're JSON based and they're REST API based. So in those cases where if you want to do a direct integration with the external system, you probably need to call the JSON sender directly. All right, other configurations. we did talk about SGG. I remember. Maybe I haven't, but I did. I did mention about a little bit when we went through all the measurements where how we actually load meter reads. So SGG is technically speaking, it's another product in C2M. So it is similar to CCMB, MDM, and SGG is another product. So the purpose of SGG is trying to talk to external systems, use a orchestrated and illustrative way of communication. And the majority of SGG is basically based on activity objects and also communication objects. So you can actually define a chain of conversation for a particular action between C2M and the external system. Now this is powerful because it is not only managing to talk to one hand end, but it is also it is actually allow you to talk to multiple hand ends based on some attributes. For example, if your device is let's say made by a Chinese company, and they have a different hand end system compared with a meter supplied by the land skier. So there are two hand end systems, and they all have different protocol, different messaging structure, and so they probably have different request and response in terms of conversation to the system for a certain action. You can define that in SGG based on the steps required. What I'm trying to say in this one is we don't have too much time to talk through the whole of SGG, but I think related to outbound, you will see some of the objects in the system actually utilize these objects. These concepts, as I mentioned on this screen. So hand-end system service provider, which is the MDM service provider, and then processing method, and endpoint URI. Okay. What you would find is there are a few objects called seeder objects, and they are actually utilizing this mechanism by default, or you can set it up in this way. So when we talk about seeder objects, we look at the IMD seeder, look at the device event seeder, or usage transaction seeder. So when these objects, or there is a request to send in these objects, so let's say create an IMD, create an IMD seeder, create a usage transaction seeder. The first thing it does is it checks what is head end, and then it looks at what is the processing method based on the action required. And the processing method actually defines what object to create, what action to perform. So there are a lot of details in that, and there are some examples I can see on the help document in C2M as well. We will look at this topic maybe a bit later because it's not really a core of CCMB functionality, but it is very useful topic if you're talking about integration with head end for metering stuff. But just remember, these configuration are additional configuration from what we talk about the outbound inbound. Okay, so these are the additional configuration for SGG. Okay, so that's everything. Thank you very much and see you next time.